Tunisia, May 13, 1943, a dust-caked processing yard on the North African coast. The largest single surrender of Axis forces in the entire war had just ended. In the space of a few days, approximately 267,000 German and Italian soldiers had laid down their arms across the Cap Bon Peninsula and the port cities of Tunis and Bizerte. The fighting that had ground on for 6 months in the desert heat was over. The men were prisoners now. Among the Afrika Korps soldiers, standing in those long, quiet lines, was an 18-year-old private from Germany named Heino Erichsen. He had joined the army as a believer. He had absorbed the broadcasts and the newsreels and the official assurances that America was a spent civilization, its factories struggling, its people demoralized, its army a collection of paid conscripts who would break at first contact with real soldiers. He had believed enough of it to fight. He was about to sit down to lunch. An American soldier set a tin tray in front of him. On it was white bread. Soft, pale, impossibly white. The kind of bread that presses down under your thumb and springs back up. There was meat. Real meat, not the compressed paste from a German field ration tin. There was a drink he had never seen before, dark brown in a glass bottle with a red label. He had no category for any of it. What Erichsen felt in that moment, and what hundreds of Afrika Korps prisoners described feeling in the days and weeks that followed, was not gratitude and not relief. It was something closer to confusion, because the food on that tray could not exist. Everything he had been told about this country said it could not exist. To understand why a German soldier in a prisoner processing yard in North Africa was staring at a piece of white bread as if it had personally offended him, you have to go back not to the war and not even to the desert campaign. You have to go back to something that was constructed in German living rooms and German schoolrooms through the 1930s, built so carefully over so many years that by the time the Afrika Korps surrendered, its men did not think of it as propaganda at all. They thought of it as common knowledge. This is the story of what roughly 370,000 German prisoners of war discovered when they sat down to eat in America, and of why a tin tray loaded with soft bread, canned fruit, and a cold bottle of Coca Cola turned out to be one of the most quietly devastating arguments the United States made in the entire war. Joseph Goebbels took control of the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda in March of 1933, within weeks of Hitler becoming Chancellor. He was 35 years old, had a doctorate in literature from the University of Heidelberg, and possessed an intuitive understanding of mass communication that was, by the standards of the era, genuinely sophisticated. He grasped something that most propagandists before him had not fully worked out. The most durable beliefs are not the ones installed by force. They are the ones that feel like things the person already knew. You do not need to convince people of something if you can arrange the world so that they arrive at the conclusion themselves and think they got there through their own observation. For more than a decade, Goebbels shaped what the German public knew and believed through every channel available to him. He controlled the radio, which by the mid-1930s was present in more than half of German households, the highest penetration rate in the world. He controlled the cinema newsreels that ran before every feature film in every theatre in the country. He controlled the illustrated press. He controlled what teachers were permitted to say in classrooms and what books were available in public libraries, and which foreign broadcasts could be received on German radio sets. He ran the most comprehensive peacetime information system any government had yet built. His America was a specific creation, assembled from selected facts and strategic omissions over years. The America Goebbels presented to German audiences was a country still crippled by the Great Depression, its industrial cities hollowed out by unemployment, its social fabric degraded by racial division and the absence of national unity. Its military was an object of contempt in German newsreels, reluctant conscripts with no tradition of serious soldiering, bribed into uniform with high wages they had no intention of earning. Its economy, despite decades of boasting, had been shattered by financial speculation and was draining away under the pressure of a war the American people did not actually want to fight. There was a particular cruelty in the efficiency of this picture. It was not built from nothing. The Great Depression had been real. American unemployment in the early 1930s had been catastrophically high. The social divisions the propaganda described were real enough to be recognizable to a German audience that had read about them. Goebbels was skilled enough to work from true material, selecting the facts that served his argument and discarding the decade of recovery that followed them. German soldiers going into combat after 1941 were not operating with fabricated information. They were operating with carefully curated information, which is more dangerous because it is harder to dislodge. They carried a picture of their opponent in their heads that was coherent, internally consistent, and almost completely wrong. The Afrika Korps had been fighting since February of 1941, across one of the most unforgiving environments in which any army in the modern era had ever campaigned. The North African desert gave almost nothing. Water was rationed. Shade was rationed. Food was designed for survival in extreme heat on minimum supply, not for anything resembling ordinary eating. The standard German field ration in the African theatre included hard kommissbrot, small tins of preserved meat, ersatz coffee brewed from roasted acorns or chicory, and whatever could be supplemented from local sources, which in the Sahara was very little. By the time the campaign collapsed in May of 1943, the surviving troops had been running on diminishing supplies for months. And then the American army handed them lunch. The 1929 Geneva Convention required the United States to feed its prisoners at a standard equivalent to its own troops at base camps. What the convention did not specify was that the American military's standard for feeding its own troops was, by the measure of every other army involved in the war, extraordinary. American soldiers in the field received rations that included canned fruits, packaged meats, hard candy, and real ground coffee, and a product that would become the single most documented item in German prisoner testimony from the entire war, a chocolate bar. Not a rationed luxury available only through well-connected channels, as chocolate had become in wartime Germany by 1943. A standard 5-cent candy bar issued to every American private as a routine part of his daily field ration. The men standing in those processing yards were being handed, as a matter of course, things that had been presented to them their entire adult lives as the exclusive indulgences of a civilization in decline. Erichsen survived the war and wrote about his experience years later in a memoir called Reluctant Warrior, co-authored with his wife Jean Nelson Erichsen. He returned to the United States in the early 1950s, became an American citizen in 1958, and spent decades with Jean running Los Niños International Adoption Center in Huntsville, Texas, helping orphaned children from across Latin America and Southeast Asia find families. He died in January of 2018 at the age of 93. But the story of what that first tray meant does not belong only to him. It runs through the accounts of hundreds of thousands of men. The ships that carried German prisoners to the United States were Liberty ships, making the return crossing after delivering supplies and troops to European ports. They would otherwise have traveled west nearly empty. Loading several thousand prisoners for the return voyage was straightforward military logistics. From the standpoint of the Germans boarding those ships, the crossing was the beginning of an education. No one had enrolled them in, and that, once started, could not be stopped. The meals served on those ships were identical to the meals served to American military personnel. Arnold Krammer, the American historian whose 1979 book, Nazi Prisoners of War in America, remains the standard scholarly account of the program, documented through extensive interviews and archival research that a number of prisoners arrived at American ports already heavier than they had been at surrender. After months on compressed desert rations, the Atlantic crossing had started adding weight to men who had forgotten what regular meals felt like. When the ships docked in New York Harbor or at Hampton Roads in Virginia, the prisoners were loaded onto Pullman rail cars for transport to camps across the country. One former prisoner, Reinhold Pabel, wrote later that the men had expected boxcars and found cushioned coaches with white-jacketed porters. He wrote that men were calling to each other from one end of the car to the other in disbelief. American citizens who witnessed the transport sometimes complained bitterly to their local newspapers about enemy soldiers riding in comfort, while American families were scrimping on ration books. They were not wrong about the comfort. What they could not see from the platform was what the comfort was doing to the men inside the train. German officers who wrote memoirs after the war consistently described the rail journey as one of the more disorienting episodes of their captivity, not because it was harsh, but because it was the opposite of what they had been prepared for. The country rolling past the windows was not the country Goebbels had described. The towns were not broken, the farms were not stripped, the factories running along the railway lines through the Midwest were not struggling. They were operating at a scale that no German soldier had been told to account for. The yards were full of material, the roads were full of trucks. At night, the towns were lit. Every town, not just the large ones, not just the important ones. The lights ran to the horizon and kept going. A total of 425,000 Axis prisoners, roughly 370,000 of them German, eventually lived in camps distributed across 46 of the 48 American states. They were held in facilities built and run in accordance with the 1929 Geneva Convention, which required housing, food, and medical care at the same standard provided to American troops at base. In practice, this meant 3 meals a day, access to a camp canteen, recreational facilities, and a wage of 80 cents per day for those who worked, the approximate equivalent of an American Army private's base pay. The wage was paid in camp scrip rather than currency, but it was enough to make purchases. The purchases that generated the most documentation in prisoner letters and later testimonies were, consistently, food and drink. Of all the items on the American camp menu, the one that produced the most intense and the most historically well-documented reaction from German prisoners was not the canned fruit and not the coffee, it was the bread. To understand why, you have to understand what bread meant in wartime Germany. The standard military bread of the German army was Kommissbrot, a dense, dark loaf built from roughly 80% rye flour and 20% wheat flour, sourdough leavened for shelf life rather than flavor, heavy and compact, designed to survive weeks on a supply wagon without spoiling. The name came from Kommiss, the old Prussian word for military commissary, a term in use since the 16th century. German civilians in the same years were eating bread made with an increasing proportion of substitute fillers, because the wheat supply was being redirected toward military use and toward feeding the occupied territories on terms that served German strategic interests. Lightness, softness, and whiteness in bread had become the markers of a luxury that ordinary Germans associated either with the pre-war years or with the small class of party officials who had access to controlled supply channels. Germany had introduced food rationing in August of 1939, the week before the invasion of Poland. The rationing system was comprehensive. It covered bread, meat, dairy, fats, sugar, and eggs, all issued through a coupon system administered through local offices down to the neighborhood level. By the early years of the war, the average German civilian was receiving roughly 2,000 calories per day, a level that was survivable but left no margin for anything approaching abundance. By 1943 and 1944, as the strategic situation deteriorated and Allied bombing increasingly disrupted the German transport network, the actual caloric intake fell below even the official rations because the infrastructure required to distribute food had been damaged or destroyed. The bread that remained was darker, denser, and less nutritious than what German families had eaten before the war, produced with substitute ingredients in bakeries that were sometimes operating under bombing threat. Coffee had essentially disappeared as a civilian product. Real coffee was reserved for the military. German civilians drank substitutes made from roasted barley, chicory, or whatever grain-based material could be ground and brewed into something brown. The official term was Ersatzkaffee, substitute coffee, and the flavor bore only the vaguest relationship to the drink it was replacing. Sugar was rationed from the first day of the war. Butter and cooking fats were rationed within months. Eggs were rationed by 1939. Meat appeared on most family tables once a week, not daily. This is the material world that the prisoners had come from. Not poverty in the sense of destitution, but a sustained, systematic, years-long compression of ordinary pleasure, the gradual removal from everyday German life of the small things that had once been unremarkable. American army kitchens served standard commercial white bread. Soft, light, the kind sold at any grocery store in any town in the country for a few cents a loaf. It was nothing remarkable to the American soldiers handing it out. To the German soldiers receiving it, it required explanation. Former prisoners interviewed by Krammer and by subsequent researchers described their first encounters with American white bread in terms the historians found almost disproportionate to the object being discussed. One former prisoner who had been held at a camp in Texas told a researcher that the first time he ate it, he thought something had been done to it. It was too soft. It did not behave like bread. He ate it and ate more of it, and by the second day had arrived at a conclusion he had not wanted to arrive at. Either this was simply what bread was supposed to taste like, and the bread he had grown up eating in Germany was something lesser, or the Germany he had grown up in was materially poorer than anyone had admitted. He chose the first explanation initially. It was the easier one. The harder one took longer to arrive, and it arrived differently for different men. For many of them, it arrived with the ice cream. No item in the documented record of German prisoner testimony produces a more consistent description of genuine cognitive disruption than ice cream. In wartime Germany, it had effectively ceased to exist as a commercial product available to ordinary families by 1943. The dairy inputs, the sugar, the refrigeration infrastructure required to distribute it had all been absorbed into the war economy by 1941. Ice cream was the kind of thing that German parents told their children they would have again once the war was won. American prisoner of war camp mess halls served ice cream routinely, multiple flavors. On an ordinary weekday, Helmut Grawe was a German soldier held at Fort Lewis in Washington state. He later wrote a first-hand account published on the United States Army's official website. He described standing in front of the camp commissary in the summer of 1944, deliberating over what to spend his camp scrip on first. His specific choice was between ice cream and Coca Cola. He noted explicitly that he had never tasted Coca Cola before his capture. He noted that the last time he had been able to buy ice cream in Germany had been years before the war began. Both were available to him that afternoon for a few cents each, in the commissary of a prison camp, as a routine transaction. He was not describing a special occasion. He was describing a Tuesday in the summer. The Coca Cola itself deserves a moment. The drink had existed in Germany before the war through a subsidiary operated by a businessman named Max Keith. When trade embargoes cut off the American syrup after the United States entered the war, Keith's operation improvised a replacement from apple pomace, whey, and leftover fruit scraps. That product was called Fanta. It circulated in Germany and the occupied territories as the closest available substitute for a carbonated sweet drink, but Fanta was made from what was left over, after everything useful had been taken for the war. The real Coca Cola, the 5-cent original served in American camps, was not available through any ordinary channel in Germany during the war years. The prisoners tasting it in American camp commissaries were encountering, in a small and specific way, the gap between what their country could provide and what the country holding them captive treated as a routine item. The canteen culture of the American camps was itself a minor revelation for many prisoners. German military life had not typically included a canteen in the American sense, a place where a soldier could spend his own money on whatever he wanted within normal commercial limits. The American camp canteen sold beer, which German prisoners were permitted to buy, and which became a subject of genuine irritation among some American citizens near the camps who resented that enemy prisoners had access to alcohol. It sold snacks, tobacco, writing materials, and newspapers, German language and American, available in camp libraries. The existence of money, even scrip money, in the hands of prisoners changed the daily texture of captivity in ways that are easy to underestimate. A man who can choose what to spend his 80 cents on is, in a small but real way, a different kind of person than a man who receives what he is given and has no other option. Hans Waecker had an experience that captures the larger pattern. He was a young German soldier held at Fort Robinson in Nebraska, who later became a physician and retired to Georgetown, Maine. When a Smithsonian Magazine journalist interviewed him decades after the war, Waecker described the American camps as a vast improvement over the material conditions most of the prisoners had known at home. He had grown up in what he called a cold water flat, the kind of urban working-class apartment that was the standard housing of a large portion of the German working class in the 1930s. He was not describing an unusual deprivation. He was describing a normal life, a life in which the things now being handed to him as a matter of routine in a prison camp in Nebraska had simply never been a regular feature. The gap between the America Goebbels had described and the America Waecker was eating his way through at Fort Robinson was not a gap that could be bridged by a different explanation. It required revising the premise entirely. The United States government understood, at least partially, what was happening in those mess halls. The Office of the Provost Marshal General, which administered the prisoner program, recognized from early on that every camp meal was carrying an argument about American capability that no official re-education effort could carry more efficiently. In the fall of 1944, a formal program was launched to try to channel this effect more deliberately. It was called the Special Projects Division, directed by Lieutenant Colonel Edward Davison, who before the war had been a professor of literature at the University of Colorado. Davison's program produced a camp newspaper called Der Ruf, which translates as The Call, edited by German prisoners willing to participate. It distributed books banned inside Germany under Nazi censorship, including works by Erich Maria Remarque and Thomas Mann, editions published by a Swedish press that had kept German-language literature alive outside the reach of the propaganda ministry. It organized lectures and discussion groups on American democratic history and institutions. The Special Projects Division was, by most scholarly assessments, a limited success in terms of its stated objectives. Hardcore National Socialists were not converted by pamphlets. Men who had committed themselves to an ideology through genuine conviction were not going to revise those convictions because a camp newspaper argued the contrary position. The program also suffered from a structural problem. It began formal operations nearly a year after the first large prisoner waves arrived, by which time most of the men had already formed their impressions of America through the more direct medium of the dining table. But the point was never the newspaper. The point was the food. The food was not asking anyone to change their beliefs. It was producing a daily material fact that existed independent of ideology and that no political conviction could override. The body of a man who has been steadily gaining weight in an enemy prison camp is receiving information about that enemy that his political beliefs cannot block. By the time German prisoners had been in American camps for several months, the weight gain was documented and consistent across the record. Prisoner letters and later testimonies recorded individual gains of 20, 30, sometimes more than 50 pounds over the course of captivity. One documented case recorded a gain of 57 pounds over 2 years. These were not men who had arrived in good health and maintained it. These were men who had been ground down by months of desert rationing and were now rebuilding. The bodies were keeping a record that the minds had not yet fully processed, and the letters the men wrote home to their families were translating that physical record into words that travelled across the Atlantic to reach households in Germany, where the daily reality was moving in exactly the opposite direction. All prisoner correspondence was reviewed by military censors before dispatch. The censors removed anything of tactical value and forwarded the rest. What they did not and could not remove was the cumulative picture the letters built of American conditions. The letters described the meat and the soft bread and the Coca Cola that many men had never tasted before their capture, and the ice cream. Former prisoners and their families, interviewed by researchers after the war, confirmed that these descriptions had circulated beyond the individual households that received them, passed from neighbour to neighbour in communities where the contrast with home front rationing was impossible to ignore. The German security services were aware of the problem. The Sicherheitsdienst, the intelligence branch of the SS, produced regular internal reports monitoring German civilian morale. By 1943 and 1944, those reports were noting with concern that letters from relatives in American camps were being shared beyond the immediate family and were circulating in communities in ways that were difficult to control. The specific content causing the most trouble was not ideological and not political. It was material. Letters describing the quantity and quality of food available to prisoners in American camps were reaching German families who were calculating their own ration coupons to the gram, and the contrast was creating questions the propaganda apparatus had no good answer to. Goebbels was sophisticated enough to understand that the letters were a problem he could not solve with a counter-narrative. A direct denial would invite the obvious reply, why would a son lie to his mother about what he was eating? The ministry's approach was to frame the American treatment as a calculated manipulation, designed to win the loyalty of German prisoners and undermine their commitment to the Reich. This framing had the advantage of being partially true and the disadvantage of implicitly acknowledging the abundance it was trying to explain away. You cannot warn people against being seduced by American prosperity without admitting that the prosperity exists. The American military had understood from the beginning that a prisoner writing home to report decent treatment was a form of communication with the German home front that no official American broadcast could replicate. A letter from a son saying he was healthy and gaining weight carried a credibility that nothing produced by any government information office could manufacture. It was also a form of indirect pressure on the treatment of American prisoners held inside Germany. The 1929 convention operated on reciprocity. The well-documented treatment of German prisoners in America made it harder for German camp authorities to justify mistreating Americans in return, and the letters made that reciprocity visible to civilian populations on both sides. There were close to 94,000 American prisoners held in German camps during the war. The conditions those men endured were determined in part by the calculation their captors were making about how American camps were treating German prisoners. American prisoners in Germany received food parcels from the International Red Cross that were often the difference between adequate nutrition and genuine starvation. Those parcels kept moving in part because Germany understood that the treatment of German prisoners in America would be measured against what Americans received in return. It was a transactional form of balance, but it was a balance. The food that American camps spent on German prisoners was not purely an act of Geneva Convention compliance. It was also an investment in the survival of 94,000 American men held in German captivity. Every letter that reached a German family describing good treatment was a small argument against the impulse to treat American prisoners worse. The investment returned something real. The German prisoners who were sent to work on American farms encountered that abundance at close range. They were not reading about it or being shown it through a carefully arranged window. They were standing inside it, picking cotton in South Carolina, harvesting wheat in Kansas, processing vegetables in the canneries of Michigan, working the fruit orchards of California. They were inside the productive machinery of a country that had been described to them for years as economically spent, and they could measure with their own labor and their own bodies how far that description was from what was actually there. The farm labor program was one of the more consequential and least documented aspects of the entire prisoner effort. By 1943, the United States was facing a severe agricultural labor shortage because the men who had worked the farms had gone overseas or gone to war industries. German prisoners filled that gap on a scale that surprised even the officials who had designed the program. At its peak, they were working in agriculture, canneries, lumber operations, and light industry across most of the country. They picked tomatoes and asparagus and sugar beets and peaches. They worked the cotton fields of the South. They built furniture and processed timber and worked on road crews. The Geneva Convention prohibited using prisoners for work directly related to the war effort, but it permitted almost everything else, and almost everything else turned out to be most of what the American economy needed. The work was paid. The 80 cents a day rate was issued in camp scrip, not cash, but it was real purchasing power inside the camp system, and it put men in the position of workers rather than purely of captives. Some farmers paid additional amounts through extra food and small gifts, which technically exceeded what the War Department guidelines permitted, because the local reality of men working hard in summer heat alongside your family made rules feel less important than ordinary human decency. The farmers, in many cases, invited them to eat, not formally, not as a managed exercise, but at the kitchen table in the farmhouse, as workers who had put in a full day alongside the family. Cecil Camlin was a boy on a farm in South Carolina when German prisoners arrived to work the land. Over the months they worked together, his family grew close to the men. When Christmas came, his mother cooked a full meal and invited the prisoners to share it. By the end of the evening, the German soldiers were gathered around the family piano singing carols while the Camlins sang alongside them. Cecil told that story to a journalist decades later, still struck by it. It had stayed with him his entire life. No lecture on democratic theory and no banned novel distributed through the Special Projects Division could produce that evening. It happened because an American farm wife decided to cook Christmas dinner and invite the men who had been working her land. That is hospitality, the oldest and most durable argument available to a human being, and it required no program, no doctrine, and no planning at all. The Reich Ministry of Propaganda attempted to address the growing body of prisoner correspondence describing American conditions. Its line was consistent. The American treatment was a psychological operation designed to manufacture favorable impressions and undermine German morale. The good food was calculated. The comfortable conditions were strategic. Do not be deceived. But the truth the ministry could not address was the one underneath the calculation. If the United States had the productive capacity to feed its prisoners, the least important mouths by definition in any wartime supply chain, at this level, while simultaneously supplying its own armed forces, its allies under Lend-Lease, and the civilian populations of liberated territories, then the picture of American economic exhaustion that had anchored German morale since 1941 was not a description of a real country. It was a story someone had told, deliberately, to keep people fighting a war they might otherwise have questioned. The man who had told that story killed himself on May 1, 1945, in the underground complex beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, as Soviet forces fought through the streets above him. Joseph Goebbels had arranged the murder of his 6 children the night before, and then died by cyanide alongside his wife Magda. The propaganda system he had spent 12 years constructing collapsed within days. The radio stations went silent. The newsreels stopped. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda ceased to exist. But the system had been failing for longer than that final week. By late 1944 and into 1945, the gap between what official German communications were describing and what German civilians could observe had become too wide to manage. The Allied bombing was visible and audible in every major German city. The food rations were visibly shrinking below even the official reductions. The men who came home on leave or were invalided back from the Eastern Front described conditions that bore no resemblance to the triumphant progress the newsreels still showed. The Sicherheitsdienst produced internal morale reports throughout the war, and the reports from the final year document a civilian population that had stopped believing the official picture, while still lacking any alternative framework for what the war was and how it would end. That alternative, for several 100,000 German families, was arriving in the mail from American camps, letters describing soft bread and ice cream and Coca Cola and weight gained and health maintained. A picture of the enemy that looked nothing like the one the ministry had been providing. What remained when the ministry went silent, distributed across farms and work details and mess halls in 46 American states, were the men who had been eating the evidence for 2 years. Many of them learned of the German surrender through American camp newspapers before any official notification reached them. Some learned it from the American farmers they were working alongside. The war, they had been told, was still winnable until almost the final week had ended, and they were still in Nebraska and Indiana and California, still eating their 3 meals a day, still gaining weight, still writing home to families who were living in rubble. Oskar Wagner was one of them. He had been captured in Normandy in 1944 and was held as a prisoner near the town of Carthage in Indiana. After the war, he was repatriated to Germany, as required. He came back. He settled in Muncie in Delaware County, Indiana, and lived there for the rest of his life, active in the local community for decades, a regular presence at the Kiwanis Christmas tree sale every year. He died on June 15, 2014, at the age of 97. He told an interviewer in 2008, more than 60 years after his capture, that he had never felt so grateful in his life as he did in that moment. He was not speaking in the abstract. He was speaking about the country that had held him prisoner and where he had chosen to build everything that came after. Alex Funke was a Lutheran chaplain who ministered to fellow German prisoners at Camp Algona in Iowa. He had been captured in North Africa in 1943 and spent the remainder of the war in American custody. After repatriation, he returned to Germany and became a minister, but he kept up correspondence for years with American officers who had run the camp. He wrote that the prisoners had been genuinely and positively impressed by what they found in America, and that the experience had won them over to friendly relations with the country in a way that no organized program could have produced. His words carry weight because they were written in German, from Germany, after the war was over, to former captors he no longer needed anything from. Cecil Camlin's Christmas story matters for the same reason. Not filed in any official record, not produced by any re-education program, not intended to demonstrate anything. A memory of a night that had not gone the way anyone would have predicted, held in the mind of a man who was a child when it happened, still present decades later because it was the kind of thing that does not leave a person. Many of the German prisoners who passed through American captivity came home to a country that confirmed, in the most concrete terms, what the American camps had already begun to teach. The country they returned to was broken in the ways the propaganda had promised America was broken. Food was rationed at near-starvation levels in the immediate post-war years. German rationing did not formally end until 1958. The cities were rubble. The infrastructure was destroyed. The men who came back from American camps returned with a calibration that their neighbors at home did not have. They knew, because they had spent years inside it, what real abundance looked like, not the propagandized caricature. The specific, daily, institutional abundance of a country that served ice cream in multiple flavors on a Wednesday afternoon in a prison camp in Nebraska, as a routine matter, without making anything of it. The returning prisoners also came back as political actors, and this mattered in ways historians have increasingly recognized. Germany in 1945 and 1946 was a country trying to decide what it was going to become. The Allied occupiers, the Americans in their zone in particular, were pushing toward democratic reconstruction. The German population was not passive in this process. Among the millions of men who had been somewhere during the war and seen things, and formed impressions that could not be erased, several 100,000 had spent 1, 2, or 3 years in American captivity. These men had seen American democracy operating, not as a lecture subject, but as a daily environment. They had watched the American press report on the government and its conduct with a directness that would have landed a German editor in a concentration camp 5 years earlier. They had watched American women working in factories and on the farms surrounding the camps, in roles German society had explicitly denied to women. They had observed, as historians have documented, the particular irony that German prisoners in many southern towns were permitted to eat in restaurants that their own black American guards could not enter due to Jim Crow laws, an inversion so uncomfortable that it quietly undermined the racial hierarchy the prisoners had been taught to accept as natural. These were not arguments. They were observed facts. Facts do not always change minds immediately, but they accumulate, and they are harder to dislodge than arguments. Several former prisoners wrote after the war that they had entered American captivity expecting to be treated as subhumans by a country their propaganda had described as barbaric, and found instead a system that, for all its contradictions and inequities, operated on principles of order and procedure that required them to be fed and housed and paid and allowed to complain to the camp commander if the food was inadequate. The complaints were sometimes acted on. That alone was a small revolution for men raised under a system where complaining to authority was not a category of behavior available to ordinary people. Heino Erichsen returned to Germany after his repatriation, as required. He returned to a country where the bread was darker than what he had eaten in Texas, where real coffee was still scarce, where cities he had known before the war were missing their centers. He had been told for years that America was the exhausted country, the declining one, the one that would not survive contact with German military power. What he found at home was that the description matched Germany now, and had never matched America at any point he had been able to verify directly. He came back to the United States in the early 1950s. He brought his life with him when he came. His marriage to Jean Nelson of Minnesota, his decades of work finding families for orphaned children across Latin America and Southeast Asia. His citizenship obtained in 1958. He had been 18 years old in a prisoner processing yard in Tunisia, holding a piece of bread he did not understand. He spent the next 7 decades in the country that had served it to him. Here is what all of it tells us, taken together. Goebbels spent 12 years building a picture of America in the German mind. He built it from a desk in Berlin, using instruments that had never been inside an American mess hall, or stood in a California fruit orchard, or sat at an Indiana farmhouse table on Christmas night, while a family technically at war with him sang carols beside him. He built it with considerable technical skill and almost complete factual inaccuracy. The prisoners built their picture from the inside, from the plate in front of them, from the weight they were gaining, from the letters they wrote home that described things their families could not reconcile with what the radio was telling them, from the farms they worked and the kitchens they were invited into, and the piano they stood around in South Carolina in December. These 2 pictures could not both be true. Over the course of 2 years in American captivity, several 100,000 German men worked out which one was. History accounts for the war in terms of campaigns and commanders, and the vast industrial machinery of destruction. It should. Those things determined the military outcome. But the peace that followed, the specific character of the relationship between Germany and America in the decades after 1945, the Germany that aligned with the West rather than the Soviet bloc, and rebuilt itself as a parliamentary democracy and became one of America's most consequential post-war partners, was shaped in part by something that appears in no order of battle. It was shaped by the letters that came home from the camps, by the men who returned and described what they had eaten, by the slow, irreversible work that a plate of food does on a mind that has been carefully taught that the plate cannot exist. The food was never the plan. There was no memorandum in the office of the Provost Marshal General stating in those words that the mess hall would carry the argument that lasted longest. But that is what it did. If your father or grandfather served in the Second World War in any role, whether he crossed on a Liberty ship or worked a farm alongside German prisoners or ran a mess kitchen in a camp in Nebraska, his story is part of this record. Put the name, the unit, the place, whatever he remembered, in the comments. These details are the actual grain of what happened, and they belong to the people who carry them. Subscribe if you want the next chapter of this history. There are more stories like this one buried in the archives of the Second World War, and most of them have never been properly told.